Tēnā koutou katoa. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the 18th Annual Frank Sargeson Memorial Lecture and the 3rd Annual Sargeson Prize Award Ceremony. My name's Sarah Sheaf, and I'm the convener of the Writing Studies program here at Waikato. It's a shame we can't meet in person this year, but circumstances have once more conspired against us. I hope you're all doing well at your various alert levels. I'd like to extend a special welcome this evening to our co-hosts for the Sargeson Lecture, the Friends of Hamilton Libraries. And I'd also like to welcome those of you who are joining us from beyond Hamilton, including members of the Sargeson Trust in Auckland, and a special welcome to the Sargeson Prize entrants from all around the country. Also, I'd like to welcome Charlotte Grimshaw, who's joining us this evening from Auckland. Before I hand over to the Vice-Chancellor of the University, Professor Neil Quigley, who'll introduce Charlotte properly, I'd like to explain the structure of tonight's event. The first part will be Charlotte's lecture, From Fiction to Fact, How Writing a Memoir Changed My Brain. I'll then hand over to Catherine Chidgey, who'll be hosting the award ceremony for the winners of the 2021 Sargeson Prize Short Story Competition. Professor Quigley will rejoin us again at the end of the evening. I do hope that you enjoy what we've got planned for you. So without further ado, Professor Neil Quigley.
E koroma, e kuima, e raurangatirama, tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening and welcome to this year's Frank Sargeson Memorial Lecture and announcement of the Sargeson Prize. On behalf of the University of Waikato and the Friends of the Hamilton Public Library, it is a great pleasure to have all of you with us this evening. This is the 18th year that we commemorate one of New Zealand's most important and influential writers, and the 3rd year that we celebrate the Sargeson Short Story Prize. Frank Sargeson was born in London Street, Hamilton, in 1903. He grew up in a puritanical household in conservative and unsophisticated New Zealand and had a difficult path as an adult. He was gay, left-leaning in his political views, and was determined to earn his living as a writer at a time when writing wasn't regarded as a decent career for a Kiwi bloke. Frank trained as a solicitor and travelled in Europe before settling in Takapuna on Auckland's North Shore. There he devoted his life to writing, gardening, and mentoring younger writers, including his protege, Janet Frame, who famously wrote her first novel, Owls Do Cry, in an army hut in his back garden. Although best known for his short stories, Frank was also a playwright and an acclaimed novelist. More than any other writer, he captured a working-class New Zealand vernacular and the society that gave rise to it. He resisted the urge of many writers to explain the behaviours of his characters and left this up to the reader to work out. It was the style that influenced a generation of younger New Zealand writers. While his first stories were about the constricting effects of a Puritan and materialistic society, many of his later writings celebrated the freedom of those who had escaped from it. His work gradually shifted from a colloquial and laconic manner to the more elaborate style of his later novels and memoirs. His influential and quintessentially Kiwi work was published around the world, including in Britain, the United States, and Australia. In the 1970s, Sargeson completed a 3-volume autobiography, now regarded as a classic of New Zealand literary non-fiction. He died in Auckland in 1982. This evening's presenter, Charlotte Grimshaw, is an acclaimed author of 7 novels, 2 outstanding short story collections, and a memoir, The Mirror Book. Charlotte has been awarded the Buddle Finlay Sargeson Fellowship and is a winner of the BNZ Catherine Mansfield Award. Her story collection, Opportunity, was shortlisted for the Frank O'Connor International Prize in 2007 and won New Zealand's premier Montana Award for Fiction in 2008, along with the Montana Medal for Book of the Year. In 2009, her story collection Singularity was also shortlisted for the Frank O'Connor International Prize and the Southeast Asia and Pacific section of the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. Charlotte has won a Qantas Media Award for her monthly columns in Metro magazine and was the 2018, 2019 and 2021 Voyager Media Awards Reviewer of the Year. Her best-selling novels, The Night Book and Soon, have been made into the TV miniseries The Bad Seed. Most recently, her memoir, The Mirror Book, was published by Penguin Random House in April 2021. It is my pleasure to welcome Charlotte Grimshaw to deliver the 2021 Frank Sargeson Memorial Lecture.
Kia ora, good evening. Thank you very much. It is great to be here with you by Zoom. It's an honour to be at the Sargeson Prize. It's such a pity that we can't meet in person. This year, pre-lockdown, I discovered the pleasure of meeting readers of my memoir who've talked to me about the book, but also about their own experiences, and I've loved that. So here's hoping we can meet again, that we can all be together again soon. So I grew up in a family in which, from my earliest memory, my father, C.K. Stead, was writing fiction, often using fragments of our real lives. And I spent decades writing fiction myself. And one day, an inexplicable impulse sent me to the bookshelf, where I found myself reading a Frank Sargeson story, An International Occasion. And the story portrays characters who share a few features with my parents, who knew Frank Sargeson well. And I have clear memories of Frank myself, and I still have presents that he gave me when I was a child. And I began thinking about a life lived in fiction, and the idea started forming to write a memoir with a specific aim. That would be an attempt to find out who I was. I had no idea what I was like and what was my real self. I'd always been able to imagine my way into other people's experiences in order to write fiction, but I seemed to inhabit a self that was in some sense a false front. And I wondered whether this was linked to a life lived in the midst of fiction. So from then on, my writing and research at that time became part of a forensic examination and an attempt to integrate and construct a real self. So some years ago, I thought about applying for a writer's fellowship, and the application needed to be based on a significant project, either a book requiring a lot of research, or I thought potentially 2 books. So I wrote a proposal for 2 books. And the first was to be a novel exploring ideas of identity in the age of Trump. And it was to be about the exercise of power in microcosm and on a macro level. I wanted to write about the idea of a family as a regime in which power might be enforced in some of the same ways as it's enforced by a state. I was fascinated by Trump, by the way he lied and gaslighted, by the misogyny that he represented and the backlash against it that probably gave rise to the Me Too movement. And I wanted to write about narcissism, conformity versus rebellion, gaslighting, fake news. And I was interested in the fact that Trump was helped into office by Russia and what that meant and continues to mean for democracy. Because if you follow the fortunes of Trump and the Republican Party in the US, you will know that Trump hasn't gone away, and the threat to democracy in the US is even greater. And I wanted to write a pacey, plot-driven story that would take place in New Zealand, France, and Buenos Aires. So that was the first book, a novel. And the other half of the project, the second book, was to be non-fiction. And it was to be a memoir exploring the way power was expressed and arranged in my literary family, the family I grew up in. And it was to be a memoir in which I explored the ways we'd fictionalized ourselves. It seemed to me that fiction had become a more acceptable way for us to express ourselves than open communication. And I'd started to feel that we operated within a nicely curated storyline we conformed to, and if we strayed outside it, there tended to be strife. Both my father and I could use recognizable material in our writing, and we could really sail close to the wind in that regard, so long as it was safely framed as fiction. So that was the second book, a memoir. And these two books, the project together, would be an exploration of the interaction between fact and fiction in my life, in my own history. And it would be the story of a family, and more broadly, it would be a discussion about the complex dynamic in families. So the first book, the fiction, would be written in my usual way, using a combination of real and invented material. And the second book, the memoir, would be a true story, the examination of a profound experience I'd had. I reconstructed my personality and my perception of myself and my way of interacting with the world by telling another person, a psychologist, the true story of my life. And in the course of telling the true story, I brought separate parts of my mind together. So I wanted to explain and describe this profound experience in the memoir. So that was my proposal, the two books. And I set it out and applied. And later on, I found that the fellowship had gone to someone researching a book on indigenous plants or something like that. So that was fine. So I forgot about the proposal, but then in the meantime, I did what I often do, what I find I've done. If I've had an idea and I've made a plan accordingly, I went ahead and did it. And one day I came across that proposal I'd written and forgotten about, and I saw that I had done exactly what I had proposed. I had called my planned project the Mirror Books. And the two books, the fiction and the non-fiction, were the novel Mazarine and the memoir, the Mirror Book. And I published the novel in 2018 and the memoir in 2021. And the two books mirror each other in that they're dealing with the same material. They're an examination of that material from two different angles. They're concerned with two processes, on the one hand fictionalizing, and on the other the processing of fact that is real, and the creation of a coherent narrative, a real story, and the use of that to map out a coherent sense of self. So the novel is an endorsement of fiction, including plot-driven fiction. And after that, I broke out of fiction. I broke ranks. And the Mirror Book is a rebellion against fiction, you could say, in a family where fiction rules. And if the two books were ever published in one volume, I would call it the Mirror Books. And I would include the quote, "Telling your story is existentially important." So how did these ideas start? At a certain point in my life, after a crisis in which my marriage blew up, imploded, I had to confront the fact that there were some things about myself that seemed strange and problematic. I also discovered that any attempt to explore what was wrong with me was blocked by my family, my parents, my sister. They would only stick to an official line that all was normal. Our family was more or less perfect. And there was nothing to see here. And Carl said to me, Where is the girl who had such a clear sense of reality and its boundaries and such a marvelous sense of humor, replaced by this scolding, as it seems to me, fantasist? So according to him, I'd lost my charm, I'd lost my sense of humor, but worst of all, I'd lost my sense of reality and its boundaries. So in other words, he was suggesting I'd gone mad. So I knew there were some really significant issues in our family, including ones I haven't included in the memoir, which is heavily censored. And obviously all families have secrets and keep up a front to protect privacy, to keep each other safe. But I was barred from even privately discussing our family problems. And every time I tried to, I was told I was making it up. I was being negative. I was not being generous. I was imagining things, and eventually I was going mad. And the more I tried, the more aggressive were the attempts to shut me down. And there was quite a wild story underneath. And I wondered at this iron enforcement of the official line. And the enforcement itself began to seem part of the problem. So in a strange and significant sense, I felt that my siblings and I had never quite been allowed to be real. It is important to say, though, that the Mirror book expressly sets itself against the idea of fault or blame. It's a forensic inspection of what went wrong with me. And I stress all through it that I love my family, and the only thing I won't do anymore is not write about my real experiences. So I was no longer willing to frame the story safely as fiction. But the memoir is not a hard luck or a sob story or an assertion that I should have had better, let alone perfect parents. No one has perfect parents. The odd online commentator has accused me effectively of whining. One issue there is the degree to which I've censored the material in the book. But I've described some very traumatic experiences and the fact that I never sought any help until pretty late in life. And yet still the odd person will say I'm moaning or wanting to have been treated with kid gloves. But I think they've essentially missed the point. I've stressed I'm not interested in anyone being a perfect parent. And I'm writing more as a mother than as a daughter. And I'm interested in how we break out of negative cycles, how we can avoid damaging one another. And my brother and others in the family have said that they love the book. And the young people in the extended family have said they found the openness liberating. And many readers have noted that I've treated my parents with respect and understanding, and that was my express intention in the book. But if I'd obeyed and not published, I think I would have remained conveniently unreal, a kind of living fiction. So I think we're all the same animal. All is connected. We all act upon one another. And there's definitely room for careful thought and the acquisition of knowledge and questioning about how we can do better. And I include myself in this, in that most of all. How could I have done better with my children, for example? So the response to the book has been hugely positive. I have noted that one reviewer wrote in a blog that my descriptions of traumatic and violent experiences made him embarrassed. He rather trivialized, but he also seemed to suggest I should be correspondingly ashamed. And I'm interested in the mysterious power of shame. I detail in the book how one event, for example, seeing a close friend killed in front of me, threw me into crippling shame, which is mysterious. And before I wrote the book, I was silenced by this strange, this shame. And I grew up in a family where we didn't seem to acknowledge serious problems. Perhaps it was embarrassing, so we tended to deny. But yes, I'm interested in shame. Shame is a prison, obviously. It can also be a weapon. And to quote the writer, and no doubt to pronounce his name wrong, Karl Ove Knausgaard, he wrote, writing as a way of casting off shame, and I think that's right. So I wanted to write a story about a family, but also to write about power. And I had the idea that an inspection of family dynamics with an emphasis on psychology wasn't just a personal inquiry. I was interested in human motivation. I had autocracy and democracy, conformity and dissidence in mind. My intention was especially to examine the vicious circle where we do unto others what's been done to us. And these issues obviously apply on a wider level. So it's not only people who do evil unto others, it's politicians, it's groups, it's countries. So to me, the Mirror book celebrates the power of family, the power of open communication, and the fact that having been at one point completely lost, I found my way to a single integrated self and to happiness. So, some time ago, I ran into my mother at the supermarket, and she was annoyed that I'd written a piece about the family. And in the course of our exchange, she said to me, "You don't even know me." And it was said in the heat of the moment. It was said in haste, but still it struck me. And I mentioned the exchange to my father, Karl, and I quoted the line, and he said, defending her, "Well, you don't really know her." And I pointed out that I'd known her at close quarters for quite a few decades. I found myself surreally reminding him that she was my mother. But he still didn't think it was an odd thing for her to say. And so "you don't even know me" seemed relevant to the questions I'd been asking. It was said in the heat of the moment, and it meant, who the hell are you to write about me? And I'd been thinking about this question, who the hell was I? And what did it mean that my mother would say I didn't know her? So I'd begun to ask questions, and I'd begun to wonder about myself. And I was the mother of 3 children, and I knew how important every interaction with them was. But when I started reading psychology texts, I got more interested in this. Basically, I guess we all know that a child forms a self and a personality in the course of relating to close caregivers, and it's a complex process of give and take. And I'd started reading about the subject when I realized I had a somewhat confused, fractured sense of who I was. And the material I found particularly interesting related to the formation of personality. I had always assumed that everything that happened long ago when you were a child was irrelevant to now. But the articles I was reading were telling me that personality is formed when you're very young, and that the issues that you have as an adult can relate to the early formative years. So genes are important, but environment matters. And so my exchange with Karl reflected his take on family, which was that the interaction between parents and children isn't significant or relevant to anything. To his way of thinking, people are born with a set of genes and that determine how they turn out. So you just have to feed and house children, and that's it. He wrote in his second autobiography, You Have a Lot to Lose, what struck me often observing our children on these trips was how much that was in each character sprang from the particular mix of elements from the gene pool. So long as each received basic nurturing and security, the character formed itself on its own terms and each was unique. And this was reasonable on its face. It suited his temperament. He wasn't the kind of guy who was going to bother with anything as boring as parenting. Fair enough, each to his own. But it also represented what I wondered, I came to think of as possibly a kind of blindness. And I wondered if he couldn't envisage the idea of the development of a child's self through relating. So for him, perhaps it didn't seem odd to agree with my mother that I didn't even know her. It didn't suggest to him that if this were true, it could be problematic. It didn't even seem to him potentially a negative idea. So I thought these questions were interesting in the abstract. There's the still face test where psychologists get a mother and a baby together and they tell the mother to adopt a completely poker face, to stop reacting to the baby and just look blank. And the baby pretty soon starts to get distressed and to scream, to try to get the mother back, to writhe around and bite its hands, and eventually it collapses in a heap. And you only have to watch this horrible experiment to see how profoundly important each interaction is for a young child. So Carl wrote that the character forms itself on its own terms, but really it forms itself in the course of each complex minute-by-minute interaction. I mean, I think we all know that instinctively, really. And I don't want to get into the minutiae about childhood or psychology, and I don't in the book. But I looked at things like that as part of testing Carl's idea about character forming itself on its own terms and family not being significant. So I'd started to wonder about myself, and I'd got the idea that there perhaps might, after all, be answers in the past and memories of growing up in family. So what did it mean that both my parents asserted, without thinking it was odd, that I didn't really know my mother? Perhaps it depends on how you define the word know. Does to know mean to understand, to find predictable, to experience as dependable, to love? If you don't know someone, can you find them predictable, dependable, lovable, even so? Is it rational to believe that the child you've brought up and interacted with year after year doesn't know you? Could my father's acceptance of the idea suggest that correspondingly he didn't really know his own children, or that he had a hazy notion of them, or wasn't really interested in what they are like? Or was there a sense in which he was elevating himself and my mother above their children? Sure, we're family, but you don't know us. How could you? How could you really? So my detached interest, my curiosity about these questions kept running up against my literary family's take on family, which was that nothing that had happened in the past had anything to do with the way we are now. Family interaction was neither significant, nor formative, nor interesting. So there was that, and there was also a kind of a rigidity. I had the sense that my siblings and I had roles, and that if we stepped out of them, it wasn't welcome. I took note of this comment of Carl again in his second autobiography, You Have a Lot to Lose, when he was describing the peace that came with writing a good poem. He wrote, I recognised there was probably something neurotic about this. One wanted to control the world and make it more orderly and beautiful than reality could ever be. So one created a world of one's own and controlled that. And this is touching in a way, this is understandable. And I'd always had a strong sense of him controlling the world. And I resisted it to a degree. And yet in many ways I conformed to it right up until I published the Mirror book, at which point I broke completely free. So I suppose you could call the memoir a rebellion against his fiction. And there's a very short reading in the book. I wanted to tell the story of our family, at least to myself, in order to save myself. All my life, Kay and Carl had been telling it, and now I didn't think it was accurate. Carl was a controller by nature. He controlled the message. He wrote the story. I learned from him, and from reading, I knew how to create a composition, shape it, make it orderly and beautiful, how to push darkness outside the circle, make wrong things right, make sure no one felt a heel unless they were outside the circle, and amusingly the shoe fitted. And then I fell out of step and started recording messy details, trying to assemble something authentic from the facts. I thought of Picasso creating a sculpture out of junk. You could make something meaningful, control the composition without disguising its constituent parts. Carl couldn't acknowledge any of it, the progression from his and my intense bond to my becoming an object of conflict, the warfare between them that overrode the normal ties of a family, the dynamic, the powerful forces, the damage. He was allergic to the idea of subtlety and duality, of hidden depths, unless they were outside. One wanted to control the world. I realized our realities weren't likely to converge. Carl and Kay's way of thinking would mean that they would see my description, my telling the true story, as evidence of a defect in me. For them, it was simple. I'd gone mad. So these were questions and ideas that could be used and explored and played with in fiction. But they had an added interest for me because I'd reached a point where I had to confront the fact that there was something unusual about my way of relating to the world. After I published the Mirror book, my mother reiterated that I didn't know her. She said I'd misrepresented her beautiful life. I said the book was actually about my life. But I mentioned to her that I'd written about things I'd never told her or anyone about, being assaulted and beaten up, about seeing a violent death, and about loneliness and distress. But her response was disdain. She made no comment about my experiences. So the reaction to the book has been in itself such a strong and difficult and interesting experience that I could almost write another book about it. So I was a fiction writer, and then I ran up against some hard reality. I had to re-examine everything. I was living alone for a while. I was devastated and I felt seriously cut off. I didn't have a network of women friends, and my systems for dealing with the world were collapsing. I didn't have any choice. It was an emergency. I needed help. So I Googled at random psychiatrists in Auckland, and I was too embarrassed to consult my GP for a referral. So I insisted on an appointment direct. And as it happened, the psychiatrist I marched in on happened to be one who specialised in the criminally insane. So he was on a break from his forensic psychiatric unit, where he looked after those who had perhaps beheaded someone or killed their whole family. But he listened to my desperate spiel, and he was very understanding. And he referred me to a psychotherapist, Dr. Marie Sanders. And I embarked on a project that turned out to be transformative. I began to tell my own story, the real story, as best I could recall it. And in the course of this, I experienced a gradual and eventually profound change in my brain. One reviewer, Emma Espiner, wrote about the Mirror book, very occasionally you encounter a book where you think, this writer saved their own life in the writing of this. And I appreciated her take very much. I felt it was true. I was trying to save my own life. And I did it by learning in real time how to have a relationship with a psychotherapist, and by replacing a fractured and inauthentic perception of myself with a real and coherent picture. So the book is an account of this process as much as it's a memoir of growing up in my literary family. And if you're a writer and you experience something as significant as changing your brain, you have to write about it. I had a lot of material to work with. In the book, I recall my father's line, when anything significant happened, I was always writing and he knew it. And he always said I was the one who could write well. And he would say to me, it's material, make a story of it. And I remember listening to Adam Dudding's Frank Sargeson memorial lecture when he talked about writing his terrific memoir, My Father's Island. And I recall Adam describing how he'd suspected his father, Robin Dudding, might have had an affair. And in the course of writing the book, Adam had researched this. He had read about 10,000 letters, and he'd finally concluded that the suspect relationship was platonic. And I waited, but that was it. That was the extent of the scandal. And I privately compared this with my family, and I thought, well, if I write a memoir, I'm not going to be short of material. So my family was in many ways, though outwardly respectable, pretty wild. And this was part of the puzzle. Why were we so wild, and why was so much of this hidden and not allowed to be revealed or discussed? Perhaps it reflected my parents' personalities. Kay was a kind of undercover rebel and anarchist. Carl was orderly and yet also in many ways uninhibited and wild. My son Conrad wrote me a terrific email about the Mirror book. Conrad is a very funny guy. In his email, he said he was considering writing his own excoriating memoir of my ill treatment of him, and was currently tossing up between calling it Sins of the Mothers and Legacy of Hate. And I said I thought Legacy of Hate was quite punchy. But Conrad described Carl, his grandfather, as the combination of intellectual rigor and rationality with whatever you want to call it, bohemianism, poetry, a kind of wildness, rigor on the home front, swashbuckling poetry abroad. That's Conrad's description of his grandfather, and I think that's pretty good. So I should emphasize that I sought this psychological help only because I'd reached a crisis point. Before that, I'd adhered to a regime of rigid stoicism. I'd never sought any help at all, zero, after witnessing the death of a close friend, after a violent relationship, or after any other trauma. I'd soldiered on through various difficulties. And in the course of that, I felt that my mind had split into pieces. So by the time of my marriage breakup, I felt that I had two selves, an old bad self that had had negative traumatic experiences, and a new self that was highly efficient, well-behaved, orderly, but also in some sense a front and not necessarily real. And I had the sense that this mental division or way of perceiving myself had interfered with my interactions with the world. So as I've said, the writing and research became a forensic examination and an attempt to integrate and construct a real self. And in all my adventures with psychotherapy and reading about psychology, I discovered that fractured narrative is the enemy of a coherent self. So I had become disconnected. I didn't confide in anyone about anything ever. I had a decades-long record of never telling anyone a single thing about myself. And as I've recently described, my tendency to self-isolate wasn't helped by the fact that I had a difficulty distinguishing the faces of people I didn't know well. So it didn't help my confidence to mix people up or to be secretly wondering if I had someone's identity right. And I wrote about bad experiences in the memoir that I'd never described to the family. So it was interesting to get their reaction. They were worried about the public facade. They put pressure on me not to publish. There was talk of suing me. My aim was to be fair and affectionate and to reflect my deep love of my family, but also to be completely honest. My parents did accuse me of exaggerating, but there's nothing that's not true. In fact, it's not exaggerated, it's censored. The first draft of the book was twice as long, and I spent months editing out content that was true, but it was just seemed too extreme, too wild to include. And before the memoir, as I've said, I translated experiences into fiction, and that was acceptable. But now that I was writing a true account, there was this exhilaration and joy in telling for the first time the true story. A psychiatrist who wrote to me described the Mirror book as an account of alienation and reconnection, and of the importance of storytelling in reconnecting. I was interested to learn that people who've had traumatic experiences often have difficulty giving a logically arranged, coherent account of them. And that people who have serious difficulties, like, say, borderline personality disorder, which I became interested in after reviewing the letters of Sylvia Plath, have problems with a coherent narrative sense of the world around them. So they lack object constancy. They live in some sense from moment to moment and are unable to rely on narrative continuity to fill in gaps like, say, a person's absence. I received an interesting email from about the Mirror book from the journalist Deborah Hill Cohn, who I believe is now studying psychology. And she talked about fragmented selves and about trauma leaving a lack of temporality in narrative identity. So I was exploring the idea that the literary families have rigidly imposed reality, and my reaction to various difficulties I'd experienced had disrupted my sense of self. I did ask the psychotherapist at one point whether she thought I was real. And this might sound insane, but it wasn't really. I was never in the least delusional. Intellectually, I knew that my perception of myself didn't make rational sense, but emotionally it did. So the question, am I real, was a reflection of the fact that I inhabited a self effectively like a false front that didn't feel entirely real for me. And there was a striking moment for me in our dialogue when Dr. Sanders said to me, "You realize the things you've described to me, the way you've tried to make good with your life, the good things you've done with your kids, for example, the person who's done those good things is the real you." And I was struck by this because previously I'd felt that the real me was the old bad, shameful self that was dead. I'd killed it off, and that anything good I'd done didn't count because it was done by the less real me, the false front. So I was actually moved to be told that the I who had achieved some good things was really genuinely me. I've related various other oddities about my adventures in psychotherapy. For example, that there are no images of Dr. Sanders online. And in between sessions, I couldn't visualize her face. So in the end, she gave me a photograph of her so I'd know what she looked like. I've been delighted that the response to the book has been huge and overwhelmingly positive. One reader wrote to me and said he'd initially been put off reading the book because the coverage of it in the Listener had made him suspect that it would be sensational and potentially nasty. And his partner persuaded him to read it. And he wrote to me to say, among other things, that contrary to his initial expectation, he'd enjoyed and understood the book and felt I'd treated my family with kindness and understanding, and that was the aim. So I'm glad so many people have got that. So the main thread of the book is the exploration of alienation and reconnection, and the idea that the creation of a coherent narrative is the basis for a unified sense of self. And I've ranged widely from personal memory to thoughts on autobiographical fiction to my layperson's reading of psychology texts in the course of describing how I became a much more solid version of myself. And as I said, I wrote the book much more as a mother than as a daughter. The book describes intensely personal experiences, but it deals with universal themes. I've never quite thought of it as an account of personal trauma, although on one level it is. But to me, it's an exploration of wider ideas, broader implications. There are the psychological questions. What can go wrong in families? What do certain experiences do to the brain? What was the scientific explanation for my perception of myself before and after I'd related my story to another person? What was the reason for my experiences with identity, with shame? What was going on in my mind? I read material on trauma and brain development. I read about attachment, and it didn't escape me that in the course of telling my true story to another person, I became attached to that person. And that this had a powerful formative effect, as if I was completing some developmental step ridiculously, absurdly late in life that I'd missed. And that made me consider the converse scenario. If you don't allow a person to express a perception of what's going on, of what is their true experience, are you preventing attachment? Are you creating what psychologists call an invalidating environment? I read that humans are inherently social and that trauma is made worse by a sense that the mind is alone. So what is the role in attachment of expressly sharing common experience? Is expressly sharing a mutual reality as necessary to the human mind as food is for the body? If you fictionalize your children, do you disrupt their sense of coherence? Do you make them feel their mind is alone? If you fictionalize yourself, perhaps by saying to them, as my mother did, you don't even know me, are you depriving them of a mirror they could use to make sense of themselves? As well as these questions, I was interested in power structures, in the family as a microcosm of a power structure, in politics, and in addition, I was always engaged with literature. So my writing was accompanied and assisted by the research and reading that went with reviewing Sylvia Plath's letters, Knausgaard's autobiographical fiction, particularly his recent long fiction, The End, with reviewing books on President Trump, which was part of my interest in his autocratic instincts, but also in personality disorders, particularly narcissism. And I read the memoir of his clinical psychologist niece, Mary Trump. So the book started with problems that I'd encountered, but as a writer, I went at them in an impersonal way, as if I'd stepped outside myself and was writing about any person. And we could have been any family in any country. My father could have been a novelist and poet, only published in Icelandic, say. This is a book about the mind. So to me, what seems relevant to the project is not that my father is a well-known writer in New Zealand. So the idea was not to write a celebrity memoir or expose, although it may have been described that way incorrectly in some local media. It doesn't depend on name recognition. The point was that my father, as a lifelong fiction writer, as controller of his own reality, also tried to control our reality and to make us live by various fictions that suited him. And my mother was his partner in this. They required conformity with their story and they refused to look outside of it. This didn't seem to me the worst of crimes by any means, but it had interesting and sometimes destructive psychological effects. And that was the focal point of my writing. To complicate matters, I had become a fiction writer myself, so the book records my progression from loyal purveyor of fiction and of our family fictions to rebellious seeker of hard facts, truth, real memories. So, and I can't see why these universal themes wouldn't be relevant to any reader in any country. And I think issues like this go beyond family. You could also say they represent a moral and intellectual test. I think of Trump enforcing his lie that the 2020 election was stolen from him. There is such a thing as truth, and there's a responsibility to stand up for truth. So when Trump banished those who wouldn't go along with his false account, he caused huge damage. And he ended up surrounded by yes people, by mediocrity. There's one more just very short reading from the book. There was the sentence that had caused so much trouble: telling your story is existentially important. I saw now why it was existentially important. My reading about psychological syndromes and disorders, all the studies and articles and textbooks had led me on a path from the Trumps to Kanowska to Janet Malcolm to Sylvia Plath, but none of that reading had achieved as much as relating the true story to another person had done. Telling the true story had changed my brain. To quote neuroscientist Mark Lewis, where the brain grasps only the immediate, there is despair. Where there is a sense of my story, where the I is not lost but firmly located within a narrative context, past, present, and future, then there is hope. This is what it is. This is what is existentially important. To be heard and understood, to have a listener affirm it, to know the mind is not alone. You are not an idealized character in someone's fiction. You are real. You are not, your literary family is not a work of fiction. They are real. What you have seen and heard and experienced is real. Your protests are valid. In every story about a dog, there is a beginning, a middle, and an end. The chant is a chant, not a beautiful song. The thread that will lead you out of the maze is the thread of narrative. But I can't talk to women, I'd said. Exactly. You had to learn it was possible in real time. So readers have responded to the universal themes and have told me that the book has made them think about the dynamic in their own families. And I've had psychotherapists tell me they're recommending the book to clients and colleagues. And one psychiatrist wrote to me asking for permission to quote the book in a training manual he's writing on trauma. I wrote the Mirror book partly as an attempt to explain matters to my literary family, They were so resistant, so closed to anything but their own story. So here, trigger, aren't we all? And I thought, they understand books. If I write a book, if I set it all out very carefully, perhaps they'll read it and absorb a different perspective. Perhaps they'll let in a different reality. And this is why I've never accepted people's suggestion that I should have waited until my parents were dead. There is no communication with the dead. And so they didn't take too well to my story at first, but in fact, I know that we are gravitating back towards one another, because the Stead whānau bond is very, very strong. It did take courage to defy my family and to tell my true story. We are not a bland group. The personalities in the family are very forceful. And it also took courage to reveal myself when I'd spent decades confiding in no one. And I did nearly lose my nerve a few times when I came under pressure. But I'm glad I published the book, because I think I've seen in the strong reader reaction that I succeeded in doing what I wanted to do. Not just to write about myself, but to write more generally. So it's a book about one possibly interesting family, but it's also about all families, how they work and don't work, and how we can all try to do better. So as I said recently, I'm going to repeat this. It is not a book about me. It's about everyone out there. It's really a book about us. Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak at the Sargeson Prize. Kia ora.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Charlotte, for your statement of faith in the power of storytelling for connecting and healing, and for inhabiting trauma in order to move past it. Your faith in the power of story is a wonderful way of passing the baton to Catherine Chidgey, and this year's judge for the Sargeson Prize for short stories, and the winners of the Sargeson Prize for 2021.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Charlotte. Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai, haere mai. Welcome to the announcement of the 3rd annual Sargeson Prize. How wonderful to hear Charlotte's recollections of Frank's presence in her life and her thoughts on the way that writing can change us, can change who we are and how we understand the world. Charlotte, you mentioned that you are accused of not being generous. I thank you for your great generosity, allowing us such a personal view of your experiences in your lecture and in the Mirror book. There's a whakatauki that says, ko te reo, te taikura o te whakaaro marama. Language is the key to understanding. By reading about the experiences of others, we also learn about ourselves, and at a time when physically connecting with fellow humans has been so restricted, we feel a sense of deep connection when we recognize our own thoughts and emotions mirrored back to us by a skilled writer. This year, we attracted a hair under 1,000 entries to the Sargeson Prize. Thank you to all of you who entered. You are proof that the short story as a form is stronger than ever and can give Netflix and TikTok a run for their money. I'm delighted that the University of Waikato has sponsored this major prize again. And I want to thank our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Neil Quigley, and our Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Professor Patrick Lehman, for their enthusiastic continued support. Thanks also to my colleagues in the English and Writing Studies programs and my assistants, Hamish Ansley and Darden Rowell. Special thanks to our Chief Judge, the incomparable Patricia Grace, Ngā mihi nui ki a koe, Patricia. We'll be hearing from her shortly as she announces the winners she has chosen. We'll also have the chance to hear a few tantalising excerpts from their pieces. This year, our first prize in the open division has increased to a very tasty $6,000. The winning stories will be published by Steve Braunius in Reading Room, a literary branch of the award-winning site Newsroom. The publication fees in conjunction with the prize money make the Sargeson Prize the richest short story competition in New Zealand. The lucky winner of the secondary schools division also receives a week-long summer residency at Te Whare Wānanga o Waikato. They'll stay in the halls of residence with all meals provided and have the use of an office in the English department. They'll also work with a mentor from our celebrated writing studies program, who will give them one-on-one feedback on their writing. If you weren't recognised in this year's competition, don't be disheartened. We'll be back next year. I'm thrilled to announce that Dame Fiona Kidman has agreed to judge the 2022 Sargeson Prize. I'll hand over to Patricia now, who will announce the winners, most of whom are joining us via Zoom.
As a student at Wellington Teachers College in the mid-1950s, I first read the short stories of writer Frank Sargeson. His collection, A Man and His Wife, which I still have, was one of the set books. Reading it was a profound experience. Up until then, books, novels, plays, poetry that had been put before us at secondary school had been exclusively English classics. I had not read anything by a New Zealand writer up until then. Now I was encountering the New Zealand voice. I was hearing and seeing the sights and sounds of my country for the very first time in literature. As I began to seek out work by other New Zealanders, I came to an understanding of what fiction writing really was. It was about familiarity, having one's own voice and knowing that one's own words, background, culture, and experiences were worthy, that one's own knowledge and understandings could be made into stories that others would read and find relevance in. I feel very honoured to have been invited by Catherine Chidgey and the University of Waikato to be this year's judge for this most prestigious writing competition. I thank them. Since those days in the 1950s, when I was making discoveries, the Kiwi voice has been embellished by many influences in our society. I have been impressed that different New Zealand voices have become part of this competition. Voice, vocabulary, dialogue have enabled character to shine, mood and tone to be set, themes and circumstances to be revealed, and storylines to play out. Congratulations to all place getters and to those who have been highly commended, but also congratulations to those who have worked hard and forwarded their entries. To those writers, I say kia kaha, kia manawa nui. Now to the announcements. First of all, to the secondary schools division, where I have highly commended 6 stories. These, in no particular order, are Flowers from 1970 by Ryan Davidson of Wairarapa College, Prelude by Anna Favell of Palmerston North Girls High School, Blood Orange Season, The Girl Without a Heart by Zia Rogers of Fielding High School. Zia won second prize in last year's competition. Highly commended also Roll the Bones by Cadence Chung of Wellington High School. Cadence was also highly commended last year. Ghosts by Andrew Crotty of Takapuna Grammar School. Second Sight by Gemma Bennion of Hutt Valley High School. I'll now comment on and announce the prize winners in the secondary schools division, beginning with third place. Many stories come about because of memories, perhaps from a recollection of a person or something said, a fragment, or even a story remembered in its entirety. Memories are a main theme of this story, moving from room to room, as it does with its narrator, in a house of remembered times. A steady, even pace in the narrative builds on recollections of a happy, secure childhood. Without it being stated, there's a sense of longing. The conclusion poses questions of what happens to memories when the place from where they originated is no longer available to the one who remembers. Do they become spectral, territorial, remaining in that place to affect future occupants? Do they lodge and move within the holder of those memories? I have awarded the third prize to Ghosts by Stella Weston of Rotorua Lakes High School. Stella will now read an excerpt from her story.
Hi. Finally, I stop in the doorway of the first bedroom and face the worst of the ghosts, the one that I knew would be waiting for me. She's lying in the bed, the duvet pulled up over her head, face lit by the light of her phone. It's past midnight, but she is up having a conversation over Instagram about things that 13-year-olds should not have to think about. Dread smothers me because I know the burden that ghost has yet to carry. Over the next few days, as I pack up the boxes, leaving empty rooms behind me, I wonder why the ghosts linger in the corners. As I wander the house for the last time, exploring each room and saying goodbye to the things I'll never see again, I wonder why the ghosts remain. As I hug my grandparents goodbye, promise to visit them in their new apartment as soon as they move in, I wonder if the ghosts will follow them, or if they will stay here in this house, in the rooms that they know, to haunt the next owners.
Also based around pasts remembered is the second placed story, wherein the writer presents memories in a manner that is engaging and unusual. It takes trees to make a forest. Individual trees can hold memories of particular times and relationships, creating its own forest. Through memory of time, place, people, and particular influences, we learn of a life so far of hopes, desires, love, passion, regrets, pride, happiness, adversity, legacy. Much indeed for one story to carry, but this is done with some skill and also with vivid imagery. The use of varied sentence lengths enables a good rhythm in the writing. Second place goes to Jade Wilson of Kaiapoi High School for What Makes a Forest. We'll now hear part of Jade's story.
Jade isn't available to join us tonight, so I am going to read an excerpt from her story on her behalf. Memories of the place mix with my wonderings. Piles of old newspapers turn into my great-grandmother's way of keeping words on hand, so that she always had a way to speak when she didn't have time to wake the breath inside her lungs and call it to swirl through her vocal cords. browning newspapers, glass jars. She never threw anything away. Bottle caps filled old crystal bowls in the liquor cupboard. They would clink when cars drove by too fast. A muffled choir of accidental wind chimes sounding from the shelves.
Of all the stories in the student section, this first placed story stood out as the one most clearly defined in regards to the short story genre. But it stood out in other ways too. Sharply drawn images bring the reader into the story. From this good beginning, it progresses via thought processes of the narrator and through words spoken. We learn of hopes and desires of two people, a mother and a daughter, or maybe a mother and a son. It's not obvious which, and it doesn't matter. We learn of the particular ambitions of the mother. We learn of grievance and of a relationship somewhat on edge at this moment in time. Writing is spare and appropriate to the mood it sets up. The use of interior monologue is impressive, giving emotive depth to the narrative. I was struck by the red gloves in the concluding sentence. An unspoken apology, an expression of love. The first prize in this section goes to Shema Jack of Logan Park High School for the story Muscle Memory. Shema joins us to read from her winning story.
The black and white keys are mountains and valleys. My hands are giant spiders, waltzing. They close the distance between each other, cross over, move apart. My right hand climbs up the untouched snow mountain of the highest keys. The clink of glass, the shapes of sunlight through water, fairy footsteps. My left plays a rhythm, full, repetitive, home. Nothing could ever belong to me as much as this does. My cascade of butterflies pouring up towards the sky, climbing, climbing. My left hand spider trips. I stop playing. The wrong note hangs, violent, in my piano room. My mother is reading. I come into the kitchen, which is lit up by slanting slabs of morning light. I put out my right hand spider and let it twirl in the sun. She looks up, smiles. There's peppermint tea in a travel mug on the counter for me. She's heard it helps with mental focus. Why peppermint? I ask, just to hear it. Her mouth opens. She glances at the mug. I thought you liked peppermint. I take it with me on my way to school. Cold air grazes my cheeks, turns them raw. I tip the travel mug and let the steaming tea pour out onto the wet black pavement as I walk. Half of it is gone before I stop. I hold it hard to my chest, so hard that it hurts. Thank you.
I turn now to the open division where I have highly commended 5 stories. They are Precipitation by Harley Hearn of Puhoi, Honeymoon in a Town Called Fog by Pip Robertson of Wellington, Close Your Eyes, Girls by Kiva McKeough of Wellington, Mam's Tables by Kirsty Gunn of Inverness, Scotland, Inside the Ribcage by Marama Salsano of Hamilton. Now to the winners of the open division. In this third placed story, it is mainly through dialogue, a contemporary Kiwi vernacular, that a reader comes to understand an easygoing relationship between 2 supermarket workers, mates, even though one is in a more senior position than the other. It is workplace banter. Words spoken and how they are delivered reveal the young age of the speakers. When others come into the picture, a reader knows, again through dialogue and through vocabulary, that these are older workers. Readers are led to an understanding. rather than being told. This is well done, but there is a problem in the workplace. Change is about to occur in the store and in the relationship with the advent of self-checkout machines. The third place goes to Jordan Hamill of Wellington for the story Unexpected Item in the Bagging Area. Jordan joins us via Zoom.
I like working packed down with Braden, even though he smells of Lynx Africa and has a tattoo of Misty from Pokemon dressed in BDSM gear for some reason. He's only a couple of years older than me and much easier to supervise than the others. I hate having to ask people to do things every day, and it's even harder when you're asking someone who was alive when the USSR was still around, especially when it's something I used to hate doing, like throwing out the pre-packed surimi or handing out wine samples. But Braden's never phased, he just does it. Meanwhile, Kim, who's been here for 30 years and clearly hasn't come to terms with the fact that toddlers and freshers spew in public sometimes, just stares through me and mutters something about the internet making everyone feel special.
The second place story captures the reader's interest at the outset, introducing lively characters while at the same time presenting a problem. From that good beginning, stage by stage, we learn of the circumstances and culture of a close-knit, loving family in their home setting. It is through action, reaction, and interaction of the main players that we come to know of hardship and resilience, but also of family bonding. The story is told from the point of view of a young boy who knows his mum is royalty. It is the mischievous duende who is the problem, and he decides to do something about it. Imagery and observation are well written. The story moves along at a brisk pace. Dialogue is crisp and credible, interspersed as it is with the language of a mother tongue. Second place goes to Mikey Santo Domingo of Wellington for her short story, The Duende. Mikey is here to give us a taste of her piece.
Hello. It was Mama's birthday on Saturday. Her birthday was the most important event of the year for us, bigger than Christmas or New Year's or any of our own birthdays. It was the only day she was guaranteed to be at home and not at the mall with a bucket of bleach or the factory packing biscuits. I gnawed hard at the inside of my mouth, trying not to think about Mama scrubbing a toilet. I always got blue whenever I actually imagined it, her hands clammy inside pink rubber gloves, the smell of chlorine and Easy Off soaking into her. It made me furious, the way people get batshit when you burn their flag.
The winning story in this senior category opens out stage by stage to form a picture of the main protagonist as part of an extended family embracing 3 generations in a particular time and place. Not an easy task within the confines of a short piece of writing. Through action, reaction, interaction, and vivid dialogue, characters and their circumstances are revealed. These are good men, hardened in their beliefs about race, religion, social class, gender. As hardened and as tough as the land they inhabit. Adding interest to dialogue is a natural use of vocabulary from the native tongues of those involved. Interest is maintained throughout, being upheld by a steady narrative flow and a certain rhythm. The story ends strongly, hauntingly, with much more to be thought about once the read is done. The winner of the 2021 Sargeson Prize is Lara Markstein of Picton for her story, Good Men. Lara joins us to read from her winning entry.
Tēnā koutou. At home, I help Oma make biscuit. I sift flour, weigh butter, stir through buttermilk until a dough resembling wet concrete forms. Oma tells stories of Opa and the villages he built for starving people in Sudan. Then she asks me to mind the hellhounds and takes the tray because her oven is temperamental. I mind them while she bakes, cleans, studies her Bible, and visits the poor. Ma and Pa lie in the back room with the curtains closed. Since moving, they've suffered from migraines. I teach Willie and Hansi English. How else are you going to watch the good movies on TV? This catches their attention. They like the cartoons with anvils dropping from the sky, bodies squeaking down glass panes. But when I start on conjugation, Hansi twists Willie's bare nipple and they're rolling on the carpet again. Fuck, I say. They freeze. It's an English word, along with bastard, cock, twat, shit, son of a motherfucking bitch. I make some of the meanings up. They repeat the words carefully, as if I've given them gold. English is like that. Ronnie taught me some of these words. He knows English and Afrikaans and everything. I can say Hamba and Xhosa, Bafuna and Zulu and Khoisikele in both languages, but that doesn't count because we have to sing the national anthem in school. At school, he slings his English around, so effortless no one knows they should be mad. Hey, Horson, how's it, fuckhead? Ronnie has some magic charm because when Skulk turns and sees me instead, his hands, which are already gristled like meat, tighten into fists. Ronnie and I run. Ngamihinui.
That brings our evening to a close. I want to firstly thank you, Charlotte, for an informative and engaging presentation. Personally, I found the Mirror book fascinating on many levels. I very much admire the skillful way in which the narrative structure of the book mirrors your view that your family life was chaos, and perhaps equally your father's view that you were the source of the chaos. The themes appear and then reappear many times, apparently randomly, but ultimately very much on a deterministic path. Equally, you explore the concepts of the accuracy of memory and the truth in a compelling way. Our colleagues in psychology tell us that memory is not a video of an actual event that can, years later, be replayed to ascertain the truth. Our memories are complex combinations of actual events and our attempts to interpret them in the context of subsequent events. As you put it in the Mirror book, we all make an account of our lives by telling stories. We roll out our own narrative. It expands in the telling, and we swear we're sticking to the truth. Truth is elusive. Our impressions are subjective, and everyone's take will vary. Fiction, though, is definite. Fiction is an arrangement of the facts just as the writer wanted them. Fortunately, in fiction, and perhaps also in life, there is no problem with each person having different versions of the truth and having their own arrangements of the facts. Charlotte, once again, thank you for your outstanding lecture. My congratulations also to everyone who participated and has been recognised in the Sargeson Prize this evening. Special thanks to Patricia Grace for her support on this as Chief Judge. Patricia, we are honoured to have someone of your calibre being part of this initiative. I know that the volume and calibre of the entries we received exceeded our expectations, and Patricia had a very difficult job determining the winners. I'm proud that the University of Waikato promotes excellence in creative, imaginative New Zealand writing, and on behalf of the university, we're pleased to be supporting and fostering new writers through this competition. Finally, my thanks once again to the Friends of Hamilton Public Library in co-hosting this annual lecture with us. We're very grateful for your ongoing support of the university. Have a good evening, everyone.